And it's nice to see Dick on Villand. So there are two waters here. Yours is the closer to the... Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kate Seeley with the Middle East Institute. Welcome to today's discussion about Iran and how best to deal with its nuclear program. Of course, it's the focus of much debate from Washington to Brussels to Istanbul, and we're looking forward to adding to the debate today. Of course, the timing for the presentation couldn't be better. The P5+1 talks with Iran over its nuclear program just wrapped up over the weekend. Not much was resolved there beyond an agreement to meet again in Baghdad, but that alone is viewed as progress, and it looks as though the potential for a diplomatic agreement is emerging, which I hope our speakers will touch upon today. Of course, we all know why these talks are so weighted and fraught. They're seen here in Washington as sort of the last diplomatic opportunity to work out an agreement with Iran. If they fail, or their failure, it's believed, will set the clock ticking toward a potential military strike with Iran, if we were to believe the narrative that Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu has set forth. However, there are voices out there, just not in official U.S. circles, that continue to insist that the final option for Iran is not a military strike, that the price is too high, that it's far better to contain Iran than to bomb it. Our guest, Paul Pillar, is one of those voices, and we're very fortunate to have him here with us today to put forward his view of containment. It's important that these other options not be swept under the proverbial rug here in Washington. And because journalist and analyst Barbara Slavin has been following this issue from her perch at the Atlantic Council, we have invited her to join us to add her thoughts and to respond to Paul's comments. Paul Pillar is a director of graduate studies at Georgetown University and a faculty member at the Center for Peace and Security Studies. Prior, he spent 28 years working in the U.S. intelligence community, and in his last position there served as National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia. Earlier, he served in a variety of analytical and managerial positions, including as chief of analytic units at the CIA. He also served in the National Intelligence Council and was executive assistant to CIA Director William Webster, among other positions. Barbara Slavin is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center and Washington correspondent for elmonitor.com, a new website about the Middle East. She is the author of a 2007 book, Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. And she's a regular commentator in the American press on Iran issues. She's a career journalist and has worked for the Washington Times, USA Today, The Economist, and the New York Times. I want to thank you both very much for joining us today. It's a real privilege and an honor. I should note that Paul will speak for about 20 minutes. Barbara will respond for about 10 minutes, and then we will take questions at the end. So I invite you, Paul, to the podium.
Thank you very much, Kate. My thanks to the Institute for the invitation, and also to Barbara for agreeing to join me here. Let me start with the proposition that despite all of the discourse and debate about this Iranian nuclear issue, I think that discourse has been deficient and defective in some important respects, and the one respect I'm going to focus on is the issue of exactly what difference an Iranian nuclear weapon, if the Islamic Republic were to build one, would or would not make in ways that would be important to U.S. interests. Instead of what I would consider detailed, careful examination of that important issue, we've had more of a conventional wisdom that has set in around town to the effect that, of course, it would be very bad, and therefore one has to go to great lengths to avoid it. Now, what passes for an argument as to spelling out the reasons why an Iranian nuke would be very bad takes one of two forms, a kind of simple form and a more sophisticated sounding one. The simple one, which we heard quite a bit, and we have heard quite a bit on the campaign trail from some of the candidates, is that the Iranians simply don't think like you and I think, that they aren't rational, they cannot be deterred, and therefore all that Cold War stuff about deterrence simply doesn't apply. And the problem with that view of Iranian thinking and behavior is it simply does not conform with the record of the Islamic Republic for now over 3 decades. And that is a record that demonstrates, I think, again and again, that the overwhelming priority of that regime is to preserve itself and its power in this life, not in some afterlife that a religious ideology predicates. And even the forms of Iranian behavior that we have rightly viewed as objectionable, terrorist activities, and more specifically something like the assassinations of dissidents in Western Europe and other countries that went on for years and years, are ones where, again, the basic Iranian cost-benefit analysis of how their interests would be affected has been quite rational, and it reflects thinking quite like ours. The assassinations that I mentioned, they petered out and basically ended back around the mid-1990s after it became apparent that they were causing too much damage to Tehran's relations with the Western Europeans, who at the time were trying to do their constructive engagement thing. We've been through this scary kind of routine before with other regimes, with Stalin's Soviet Union, with Mao's China. I like to make that comparison. China tested its first nuclear device in 1964, and this was when they were still just having come out of the Great Leap Forward. They were still just getting into the chaos and the fanaticism of the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong was saying, China would do okay in a nuclear war with the United States or the West. We might lose a third, possibly even half of our population, but we'd come out of that triumphant over capitalism. I haven't heard anything like that from the Iranians. And then, of course, we had the first Islamic bomb when Pakistan got it, and we had some of the same sort of scary stories. The fact is the Iranians are not suicidal. They are not going to lob a nuke at Tel Aviv the first time they get one because they know what the response would be. It would be absolutely devastating and suicidal for their own regime and their own country. And so basically in terms of this first sort of simpler form of the argument, we're dealing with a rather crude stereotype of people who wear beards and turbans. The more sophisticated sounding argument, which is less what the politicians talk about and more what policy analysts talk about, is that even the mere possession of a nuclear weapon, even if it's not lobbed at Tel Aviv, would make a difference in making the Iranians somehow more aggressive, more prone to take risks in a way that would redound to our disadvantage in the Middle East. And that conforms with a popular sense that if you did have an Iranian nuke, that somehow this really ought to make a difference to people's behavior. But you got to go farther than that and go beyond the vague formulations, which is basically what we hear about an Iranian nuke shielding more aggressive behavior, or Iran extending a nuclear umbrella to Lebanese Hezbollah or someone else. What does that mean specifically? Well, it means specifically Iran would be threatening to escalate whatever is the issue in question, whether it's some dust-up between Hezbollah and Israel or whatever, to the level of nuclear war involving Iran itself. That's what it means. That's what we meant when we talked about extending our nuclear umbrella to Western Europe or someone else. And that gets right back to the earlier point that the Iranians are not suicidal. And I've scratched my head and tried to come up with some scenario, some issue, where we could say, all right, this is something the Iranians would like to do. They are not doing it now because they see someone, the Israelis, us, the Iraqis, Saudis, whoever, holding some threat over their head of retaliation or response. A threat that would be neutralized by an Iranian counter-threat to escalate things to the level of nuclear war, and that this issue is so important to the Iranians, whatever it is they want to do, that it indeed would be credible for them to say, we're going to escalate this to the level of nuclear war. I've scratched my head, and I have not been able to come up with think of any issue that meets those criteria. Now, what about, say, like the Tomb Islands dispute with the Emiratis? I really don't think that would be credible to say that, escalation to the nuclear level would take place, nor any of the other disputes I can think of involving Iran or its clients or its allies. So basically what it comes down to, and I would concede there's something to this, but not very much to it. A sort of vague sense that Iran would somehow, if it were armed with a nuke, feel its oats a little bit more than it does now. And that's basically what we're left with, a sort of inchoate oat feeling together with worst-case assumptions about things that Tehran might do. Now, I would remind you, since what's often injected at this point in the debate is all the undesirable things that Tehran does that we don't like, the terrorism involvement, the absolutely awful rhetoric on a lot of different issues, their alliance with Syria, you can go on and on and on and on. The issue is not whether this is a likable or loathsome regime. I happen to think it's pretty loathsome. The issue is what difference in its behavior or the responses of someone else would make from what we have now with the advent of a nuclear weapon. And that's the real issue. Now, I hasten to add, I'm in agreement with the consensus of 99% of other people in this town that it would be better off for all of us if Iran did not develop a nuclear weapon. Ultimately, I think the Iranians are going to be a lot better off too. But we always have to consider, what the trade-offs are, what are the alternatives, and as Kate mentioned in the introduction, the big alternative that's sort of hanging over everyone's head is use of the military option and everything that implies. And so what you really have to weigh is that vague sense of feeling oats against what the consequences of using the other alternative would be. Now, there's also the other issue I just want to touch on briefly because it's an important one, and that is the specter of a cascade of other proliferation elsewhere in the region if the Iranians got a nuke. That would be a bad thing. It would be a blow to the global non-proliferation regime. But I would remind people of a couple of things. One, we've got a long record of overestimation of the pace and extent of nuclear proliferation ever since John Kennedy was talking about, we might have 25 nuclear powers by the 1970s. Which is just about as long as the record of overestimating the pace of the Iranian nuclear program. And I would also add that for the countries that we most often think of, like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, who would perhaps the main candidates here for this, they've been dealing, number one, with living with Iran and all of its questionable behavior for quite some time. And, of course, they've been dealing with a far larger nuclear arsenal on the part of the Israelis, which dates back to the 1970s. Stephen Cook recently did a piece that focused on those three prime suspects, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and concluded, based as a matter of capability as well as intention and incentive, bearing in mind, among other things, how the United States would respond to each of these three countries if they went nuclear, that we really don't have a whole lot to worry about in terms of any of those three countries itching to become nuclear weapon states, even if Iran was believed to have crossed that threshold. Now, I don't want to take the time to elaborate all of the effects, the possible effects of implementing the military option. Let me just say, by way of abbreviation and summary, that number one, nobody knows for sure exactly what those effects would be, and it's rather striking that people have gone as far in their talk about exercising such an option without having a more detailed understanding of what the effects would be. And secondly, that the effects would be multitudinous on the economic area as it relates to the oil market in particular, on the security level with regard to what Iran would do in response, seeking out, in my judgment, whatever asymmetric means would be available to them to respond in times and places of their own choosing. And not least of all politically, both internally in Iran in terms of the rally around the flag effect that it would have on to the benefit of the hardliners in the regime, and perhaps most important for us in the United States, the overall perceptual impact on how the United States is seen, especially by Muslims worldwide, that this would be one more instance of the United States supposedly being out to kill Muslims and lord it over their part of the world. And against this, of course, is the point that needs to be made that exercise of the military option is not going to prevent a nuclear Iran. It's going to most likely lead to the Iranians to make the decision, which according to our intelligence community they have not yet made, which is to go ahead and charge ahead, full speed ahead, to make a nuclear weapon. And most likely they would also kick out the international inspectors, and whatever they would be then doing, we would be half blind in trying to monitor it compared to what we have right now. Now, part of the title of this session was containment. I'm going to differ a little bit with how Kate and the Institute phrased the issues here. We've got containment of Iran right now. We will continue to have containment of Iran, whether or not they have a nuclear weapon and whether or not we attack them or the Israelis attack them. If they are attacked, we will face a more difficult containment job. It will be one in which, as I just suggested, the Iranians will have kicked out the inspectors, will have made the decision to go ahead and acquire a nuclear weapon. And that strikes me as a much harder containment job than what we face now. Fortunately, there is, I think, a way out of this, and this refers to the diplomacy that Kate raised, and indeed this is timely for us to talk about it. I think that there is plenty of negotiating space to be explored and in which agreements and understandings can be reached between the Iranians and the P5+1 that will satisfy both the need for Iran to see any such settlement as a win for themselves to justify within their own regime and to their own people that they have not given up what they have repeatedly proclaimed as their right to a peaceful nuclear program, while at the same time satisfying the needs of us and our Western allies of assuring ourselves that that work is not being devoted to military purposes. And most of the outlines of an understanding, I think, have already been commented on quite a bit, especially in some of the commentary just over the last few days, to the effect that it would most likely include things like continued Iranian enrichment, but with limits that would do away with the 20% enrichment stuff, impose something like the 3.5% or 5% limit, that would include intrusive inspection that would go even beyond what they have now, full adherence to all the additional protocol provisions of the IAEA, and perhaps even more than that. That's the assurance part for us. And very important to get that sort of stuff with the Iranians making those sorts of concessions, the beginning of a process of taking off or reducing the sanctions, the whole ostensible purpose of which, we should remind ourselves, was to get precisely those kinds of concessions from the Iranians. Now, that's a lot of space that still needs to be explored. There are an enormous amount of technical details that need to be negotiated, and so it's going to take a lot of time. I have been struck, although not surprised, by how much this one day or day plus an evening round in Istanbul that we just had this last weekend became the subject of enormously inflated standards and expectations, as if Lady Ashton and Undersecretary Sherman and the others hadn't come back from this meeting with a signed, sealed agreement in hand that this some people consider that failure. Well, of course, that's nonsense. Having not even met and talked about these things for over a year, I think we ought to regard the Istanbul meeting as properly little more than a get reacquainted session and indeed the agreement to meet again in Baghdad next month. And in addition to that, at the Iranian suggestion, to have deputies' deliberations between now and then strikes me as, by the standards of international diplomacy in such situations, very considerable progress, in fact, even rapid progress. Let me stop there. I look forward to hearing Barbara's comments, and I'm sure there'll be plenty left for discussion.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Emmy, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here, whether sitting in the audience or up here. I'm a little bit at a disadvantage because I largely agree with Paul's analysis, but I'm going to try to play devil's advocate just a little bit. I think in particular on last weekend's meetings that I certainly got a sense that the Iranians came out of it a little bit better than the P5+1 did, because there were expectations that there might be some kind of commentary, at least on the 20% issue, something more than just an agreement to meet again in Baghdad, of all places. In the run-up to the talks, the Iranians had, of course, as you know, played their usual games, and first they agreed to Istanbul, and then they said, well, maybe we'd rather go to Beijing, maybe we'd rather go to Baghdad or even Damascus. And these were clearly non-starters from the point of view of the P5+1. They weren't going to meet for the first time with the Iranians after 15 months in Damascus, certainly, or even Baghdad. So I think the Iranians got something out of this, and if you look at their commentary in their official press, they are beating their breasts and declaring victory over this particular round, which frankly I think is fine. You know, I agree with Paul that obviously if there's going to be any kind of confidence-building measure, any kind of arrangement that reduces tensions between the two countries, the Iranians have to say that they won something. They have to say that they outsmarted the P5+1, that even though they were outnumbered, they used their asymmetric diplomacy, their judo diplomacy, like North Korea often does, and did something unexpected and put everybody else off balance. That's fine as far as it goes. I think there's some other issues, though, that we have to look at in terms of containment. Obviously, we've been containing Iran for 33 years. We've been trying to minimize the amount of damage that they do in the neighborhood and control, certainly over the last decade, the pace of their nuclear program. And we can argue about how successful we have been. Certainly on the nuclear front, there were a number of missed opportunities, I think, to cap the program at a far earlier stage than what we're facing now. In terms of Iran's regional posture, I'm not sure that the United States can claim any credit for this, but I think the Arab Spring has gone a long way to check Iranian influence, particularly when we look at the situation in Syria and the rise of these Sunni Muslim movements that are ambivalent at best and hostile at times to Iran. So I think we can say that we are containing Iran and quite effectively. We haven't talked about the sanctions and how draconian they are. Apparently, at the meeting in Istanbul, Saeed Jalili spent a great deal of time with Baroness Ashton saying, you have to lift sanctions now. You have to give us some relief now, according to an account that we had in almonitor.com by Laura Rosen, who covered the talks. So we have some leverage. The Iranians have leverage, too. Despite what President Obama says, that he is not interested in containing Iran, that an Iranian nuclear weapon is unacceptable, I really don't believe him. I think that he feels the need to use this kind of rhetoric, in part to contain the Israelis, who, of course, are using every opportunity to raise tension in the hopes that it will slow the Iranian program, it will inhibit them in some way. But in fact, if we look at the record of what happens with countries like this that get nuclear weapons, as Paul mentioned, what happens is if they do in fact get nuclear weapons, the United States sits down and negotiates with them in a very serious manner. This has certainly been the pattern with China, with the old Soviet Union. Our relations improve somewhat with Pakistan, certainly after 9/11, and the fact that they have nuclear weapons is one reason that we don't make Pakistan the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, as indeed it is, not Iran. But we don't dare say that. We have transformed our relationship with India which of course developed nuclear weapons. We have tacitly agreed that Israel can have a nuclear arsenal. So, in fact, the record is that once these countries get nuclear weapons, the United States tends to take them more seriously and initiate a process of détente. With Iran, though, this is a little bit more complicated than it is even with countries like China or the old Soviet Union, Pakistan, India, North Korea. We have a very, very tortured history with Iran, which is really unique, I think, in the annals of our relationships with other countries. United States was a very popular country at one point in Iran, and then we had 1953. We overthrew Mossadegh. We put the Shah back on the throne. We became not only the number one enemy, but in many ways a scapegoat for the failings of the Iranian Revolution over the last 33 years. So I think that's why this is a particularly sort of tricky time. Even advocating a normal relationship with the United States and Iran is still a very controversial thing to do and can get you into a lot of trouble. So this will follow a unique path. This is going to be a unique form of containment. I still personally think that the Iranians can be stopped from actually developing nuclear weapons because I think they are smart enough to understand that crossing the line will not bring them many additional benefits from where they already are now in terms of us not really knowing how much they know about how to make a weapon. But it will bring a lot of disadvantages in terms of even more massive sanctions. They will alienate those non-aligned countries which have come to their defense from time to time against the so-called double standards that don't punish Israel for having nuclear weapons but punish Iran simply for having a suspicious nuclear program. They will, of course, expose themselves to be liars. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, just reaffirmed a 1994 fatwa in which he said that possessing nuclear weapons would be a great sin for a Muslim country like Iran. So actually crossing the line, I don't think brings them that many benefits. So then the question comes down to, can we live with this uneasy, ambivalent situation in which we know that Iran is steadily enriching some uranium to some level, that it is probably improving its knowledge of how to build a nuclear weapon covertly in ways that the IAEA can't see. Can we live with this? I'm with Paul. I think we can. We've been living with some difficult situations for many years. I think the key thing here will be to manage it in such a way that the Israelis and the Gulf Arabs are reasonably secure that Iran, in this ambivalent situation, is not going to be an unacceptable threat to their security. And the Israelis, as of course all of you know, are having a very public and noisy debate about this with many of their intelligence and military experts. Indeed, I think pretty much all of their current former top military and intelligence officials saying that the military option doesn't exist in terms of curbing Iran's nuclear program, that this isn't the way to go. I wanted to quote something that Suzanne Maloney wrote recently, which I thought was really, really wise. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit. Of course, she's at the Brookings Institution. And the way she puts it is that the only way to actually stop Iran from building a nuclear weapon is if its leadership decides to do so, if we can change the psychology that has led the leadership to pursue this nuclear program. And Suzanne says that Washington and its allies can help, or more likely hurt, only around the edges. Eventually, Iran's economic, ideological, and conventional military clout will wither under sanctions and pressure and isolation. And so we simply have to be patient. We have to hang in there, as hard as that sometimes is, particularly in Washington where everybody wants instant solutions to everything. My own feeling is that eventually the Iranian system, will produce the Ayatollah Gorbachev we've all been searching for. We didn't get it under Khatami. He turned out to be Ayatollah Khrushchev, not Ayatollah Gorbachev. But the system itself, under these kinds of pressures, will eventually produce the sort of leadership that we can live with, perhaps in greater comfort. And until then, we can contain Iran.
Thank you both. Why don't you stay on here? And for all of you who joined, thank you both for your comments and for your very rational views of Iran. I think we have a lot of Iran experts in the audience, and I'm just going to open the floor to their questions. If you could please give your name and affiliation, the gentleman in front.
Hi, Jonathan.
And if you don't mind speaking into the microphone.
Okay. Jonathan Broder from Congressional Quarterly. I'm not an Iran expert. But I would like to ask you something about the role that Congress is playing in this. As you know, Congress is talking about passing even stronger sanctions legislation. And while these sanctions bills that they're passing include executive waivers, it strikes me that at this time, over the next year until November, it's going to be more and more politically difficult for President Obama to utilize the utilize the waiver and make a concession to the Iranians if they make a concession at the negotiations. Excuse me. Can you comment on that dynamic?
I agree with your description, and I would consider that dynamic to be one of the bigger hurdles that we face, and certainly the administration faces. Not only is there all the just the politics of it, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, of course, is talking about it quite actively. Senator Kirk in the other chamber, among many others. It's not, in my view, going to be enough in the Iranians' eyes to have nothing more than say, well, we won't impose anything more than what we've already got in train. That will not be enough. It might not even be enough to say, well, we're not going to execute the stuff mid-year that's already in train. Probably the biggest set of challenges the administration faces is this difficulty in walking back from existing sanctions. Politically, which is what you're describing, but also even just as a matter of law and procedure. It's hard to do. A lot of the other sanctions, many of the sanctions refer to things other than the nuclear weapons issue. They talk about human rights, they talk about the terrorism connection, and so on. And as Barbara correctly mentioned, it's going to be very difficult to basically make nice to Iran or be seen to be making nice. And especially between now and the first Tuesday of November, it's going to be very difficult. So between now and the first Tuesday of November, the administration is going to probably start feeling itself in a squeeze between being able to talk about enough progress being made on the diplomatic front versus trying to do anything with regard to walking back from sanctions. And this approximately 7 months or 6.5 months that we have yet to go until that date is probably going to seem like 6 years to the administration before we get partway through the summer. Whether it's going to be too much of a squeeze or not, I don't know. But I certainly agree with Barbara that this administration is certainly not one that's seeking a war with Iran. And I believe that everything we heard the president say earlier this year, especially when Mr. Netanyahu was in town about an Iranian nuke being absolutely unacceptable, was a matter of buying time from the Israelis. And some of those words I'm sure Mr. Netanyahu has pocketed and will be ready to come back if Mr. Obama wins a second term to remind him of next year or the year after.
Yeah, well, I think when Netanyahu said over the weekend that Iran had gotten a freebie, he was showing his true feelings, certainly, about the results of our presidential election. I agree that it's going to be difficult, but I think that there is a path to managing the situation, and that's what has been out. We've all discussed the stopping of the 20% enrichment. Iran now has about 100 kilograms of uranium enriched to 20% U-235, and that's about enough if you further enrich it for one nuclear weapon. If they can stop just at that level, I think, the Israelis are always going to ask for more, and Congress is always going to ask for more, and UN Security Council resolutions ask for more. They demand a complete suspension. But simply that one step, I think, would buy the time, perhaps, that the administration needs. And from the Iranian point of view, the situation is really dire. These economic sanctions are really having an impact. And Anything, I disagree with Paul. I think simply not implementing fully the European oil embargo and the central bank sanctions would be enough for the Iranian government to say we have a victory, we've managed to stop sanctions in their tracks, and again would buy us some time for us to come back to this after our elections.
Great, I think we'll do two questions at a time.
Tom Green, a retired Foreign Service. Could you comment on the Brazilian-Turkish entente with Iran last year that seemed open a possibility of a settlement? It was then rejected, and it left in some circles the impression that the U.S. didn't want there to be a settlement, a peaceful settlement with Iran on the nuclear issue.
Yeah, it was actually 2 years ago. How fast time flies when you're having fun with Iran. The problem with that deal, the Turks and the Brazilians operated in good faith according to instructions in a letter from President Obama to President Lula of Brazil. But by the time the Iranians agreed to send out 1,200 kilograms of low-enriched uranium, they already had a lot more, so it was no longer most of their stockpile. Also, the way the agreement was written, Iran could demand back that stockpile anytime it wanted from Turkey. The original deal, it was supposed to be turned into fuel for a reactor that makes medical isotopes. And the third factor was that the U.S. had just gotten the agreement from the rest of the P5 for a massive new UN sanctions resolution, which subsequently did pass in the summer of 2010. So it was too little too late, even though it was a good faith effort.
And the principles involved may well be at the core of agreements yet to come. That is to say, fuel swaps that involve fuel plates or rods coming from a non-Iranian source to fuel the Tehran research reactor.
Yeah.
Questions?
Stunned you into silence.
Room.
Stephen Stern, I'm curious what you, in terms of if there is an intrusive inspection regime, how that plays out culturally, diplomatically, in terms of regional and global relations. I mean, we've seen inspection regimes become the center of a lot of friction in other situations.
Well, you already have an inspection regime. You already have IEA officers on site, so it's not a qualitatively different thing. And I would be pretty relaxed about the Iranian regime's ability to handle this as a matter of public relations and image. I mean, there's no reason they have to go into details with their own people about, well, we've agreed to this many more inspections or this facility and not that facility. I mean, that's going to go totally over the head of their people anyway. So I'm not too worried about that, given that there is an inspection regime in place now.
David Mack, Middle East Institute. I think you've both made very compelling presentations, but I think you're overlooking a larger U.S. foreign policy objective, which may seem visionary, but ought to be our goal down the road, and that would be a weapons of mass destruction free Middle East. It seems to me that as unlikely as that seems now, circumstances could evolve so that it would be attainable, and we shouldn't give up that idea or further complicate it by having one more nuclear power in the region if we can avoid it.
Absolutely agree. And in fact, the Finnish diplomat and his team, who are charged by the convening authorities, one of which is the United States, to organize a conference by the end of this year. And what I hear is that it probably will take place, it will be close to the end of the year, on a Middle East, actually not just nuclear, but weapons of mass destruction free zone. It will include the other types of unconventional weapons as well. I think that's all for the good, even though there are an awful lot of ways in which other things in the Middle East are going to have to change, most notably Israel's relationship with its Arab neighbors and with the Palestinians, before it can become a reality. I think as a matter of principle and objective and diplomatic strategy, it makes sense to continue to voice that as an objective and to continue to have things like the meeting that will be held later this year. And of course, this is consistent with the declared objective of our current president, as it was of Mr. Reagan and others, for a zero nuclear world eventually.
Of course, a key component of this would be Israel ending its policy of ambiguity, opacity about its nuclear program. And I think this is being talked about more in Israel than it was in the past, in part out of a sense that if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, that a declared Israeli nuclear arsenal might actually be an element of deterrence. And there's an excellent book by Avner Cohen, if any of you haven't read it, The Worst Kept Secret, it's called. And I think this is something we should be encouraging the Israelis to do. There's no reason we can't have an agreement with them like the one we have with India, which normalizes and its nuclear program and brings it into a position where it can openly engage in arms control talks.
And of course, we've got the precedents of the other regional nuclear weapons-free zones, some of which, the Latin American one in particular, was negotiated at a time when the Brazilian-Argentinian question was far more problematic than it is now in terms of the nature of their rivalry and how a nuclear dimension played into that.
Hi, Victoria Taylor, Council on Foreign Relations. I believe that the P5+1 strategy is still theoretically dual track, but however, we don't hear a lot about the incentives side of that. And so I'm wondering if the incentives package that used to exist is still out there, if there's any incentives that might entice the Iranians to reach an agreement. And even if there is such a package, would it be politically possible for a U.S. administration to offer any incentives at this time?
Well, I don't think I think it's politically very risky for something to be described as a package at this point, as opposed to what the administration is saying, and that is we are observing the principle of reciprocity. So that sounds more like we're still waiting for the Iranians to kind of go first, perhaps at this next round. Politically, I think that's about the only thing we can expect from the administration at this point. One hopes when these deputies meet and then when this Baghdad meeting takes place that more will be said in the confines of the conference that the Iranians might view indeed as a package. But when we talk about incentives, let me make another basic point here. To get the Iranians to do what we'd like them to do and for them to have incentive to do what we want them to do has two basic halves. One is the pain and pressure side, and that's what we've heard about again and again and again with all the sanctions. And that's about the only thing we hear, certainly on the Hill. The other side is persuading the Iranians that we are serious about making a deal, that we are not just checking a box here before we go to the military option after being able to declare diplomacy a failure. And to be quite blunt, there are a lot of people who do view it that way. That's not the way the administration views it, and that's not the way we should view it. But the Iranians have plenty of reason to be distrustful in terms of what our intentions and the intentions of some of the rest of the P5+1 are. So that's the other half. And in my view, that's the half that we need to work on at least as much. The pain and pressure, my goodness, we've had, if you want to take pain and pressure as an end in itself, which unfortunately it too often is viewed as on discussions of this topic, we've had lots of success. The administration has had plenty of success in getting these multilateral sanctions to the point they are at now. I think the bigger hurdle is going to be the incentives on the other side, getting the Iranians to believe that we really are serious about this. And among all the other reasons for them to have distrust, I have to mention, one other thing, and that is the whole Libyan episode, where, we did reach a deal with Gaddafi, along with the Brits, for him to get out of the terrorist business and to open up and give up his weapons of mass destruction programs. And then when the first opportunity arose to assist in an effort to overthrow his regime, we took it. The North Koreans have drawn the lesson very explicitly, and the Iranians even have said a couple of things, but regardless of what they've said publicly, they've clearly drawn a lesson too. And that's a lesson that's going to have to be unlearned, and that's a lot of what these negotiations are going to have to do.
If I could just add, there is still technically on the table a package that has been included in every UN resolution on this issue, I think going back to 2006. It was reiterated in 2008, and it promises things like assistance to the civilian nuclear program of Iran. Iranians, I know, are very unhappy with the Bushehr reactor, which is an old Russian model stuck on a German base, and if they are going to have civilian nuclear power, they would much rather have modern technology. The Tehran research reactor that needs to be refueled is 1960s technology from the United States. So I think there are a number of things one could do, but obviously the administration is going to be very nervous about anything that looks like an Iranian agreed framework, given especially what's happened with North Korea and how the latest agreement with the North Koreans has fallen apart.
And look, we haven't even talked about, and I think we should talk about, taking a broader framework, all of the other issues that are of joint concern to us and Iran, from Afghanistan to Iraq to drugs in Afghanistan, and plus all the other things that are, of course, of more special concern to Iran, where they are the demandeur, whether it's frozen assets or something else. The long-term objective, in my view, ought to be not just to solve this nuclear thing that we've gotten ourselves all tied up in knots on, but to move toward a more normal relationship between Washington and Tehran. You know, we got a glimpse of some of what we can do back during that brief window in time when Jim Dobbins and Zal Khalilzad were working with the Iranians in late 2001 and the first few weeks of 2002 with regard to Afghanistan. And then we declared the axis of evil and slammed the door in their face. It would be nice to at least get back to the point we were at in late 2001.
Molly Williamson, American Academy of Diplomacy. I thank you both for your very eloquent analyses. You were very constructive in painting the picture of rational actor, and I ask now your analysis of the perception of the United States as a rational actor. Our ability to move back from, if this is necessary, the notion that there must be regime change in Iran. We cannot work with an Iran under current leadership that allows people to conclude that no matter how they might modify their behavior, it will not be good enough. Ultimately, the United States and others want the leadership to go. And how can America, as a rational actor, do this before, say, the second Tuesday of November?
Well, that gets to the heart of what I was commenting on before with regard to the mistrust that the Iranians have of the United States and what the basis for that mistrust is and how the Libyan example works into that as well. That's exactly what you're talking about. I think there is a great deal of concern and perceptions in Tehran exactly along the lines that you said. And goodness knows, one can just look at rhetoric every week in this town to bolster the view in Tehran that we really, in the end, are really, really concerned about regime change. That's our objective. And if that's the perception, then that, of course, is a deal killer. Why make any concession or take any risk if you think the other side is ultimately going to wants to get rid of you? As I said before, that's part of what I hope this negotiating process is going to do in terms of building trust, and that's part of why the process is going to be a long one and a difficult one. But beyond that, I don't have a magic way to overcome the political reality of what's said about Iran in this town that gives rise to that sort of perception.
I should point out the Iranians say some awfully nasty things about us, too. So, rhetoric alone, I mean, Paul mentioned the axis of evil. we continue to have high-level discussions with the Iranians for another more than a year after the Axis of Evil remark, the talks that took place in Geneva and Paris at assistant secretary level. So if it suits them, the Iranians are perfectly willing to ignore the rhetoric, I think. The question is whether they can develop a different sense of whether they can see a path forward for the U.S. and Iran that doesn't threaten the survival of the regime. And that's a very big question. Hating the United States is a cottage industry there. And it will be, as I pointed out, a détente with Iran will be, I think, much trickier than the kinds of relationships we were able to develop with Russia and China.
Dick, I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. Would you talk a little bit about your perceptions of what is happening inside Iran that is going to be affecting attitudes there, both in governing circles and in broader circles, that will or will not, or might not, affect the Iranians' desire for an agreement, some kind of an arrangement, or something that is going to impede it? You've already touched on it some, but could you go into this a bit more?
Yeah, sure. I think that's why we do have an opportunity here for some sort of limited understanding that will reduce tensions and cap the program, because I'm hearing from Iranian friends, that they're begging for Ayatollah Khamenei to drink the poison. This is a reference to what Ayatollah Khomeini did in 1988 when he accepted a ceasefire in the Iran-Iraq war. People are really hurting. And I think that, especially given the Iranian control of the media, they can spin this in a way so that it looks like a victory for them if they're able to simply forestall some of the sanctions. And it would do a lot to not make the regime hugely popular, because it's not, frankly, and hasn't been for a long time, particularly not since 2009 and those presidential elections that had so much fraud and the crackdown and so on. But it would relieve some of the pressure, on the government. They'd be able to sell a little bit more oil. They'd be able to pay off a few more of their loyalists. So I think, I'm speaking just to somebody who is in touch with Iranians and follows, developments there as closely as I can. I haven't been there for 4 years. I would love to go back. I hope I get a visa. But my sense is that the government has a feeling of insecurity about popular opinion. At the same time, it's consolidated its hold by marginalizing the reformists. It's just had parliamentary elections where Ayatollah Khamenei's loyalists have come out on top. He's put Ahmadinejad in a box. He's put the reformists in a box. So that's why I think there is a possibility for something. We shouldn't get our expectations up. This isn't going to be the great breakthrough or the grand bargain, but just something basic that reduces tensions.
And we should not and cannot wait for the emergence of Ayatollah Gorbachev.
No. We don't know when he'll come. He's like the Mahdi. We don't know when he'll come.
And I'd say Khatami was more like Ayatollah Chernenko than Khrushchev.
No, Khrushchev.
Question here.
Chernenko. A little more vigorous.
I'm Hassan. I was born in Tehran. I'm doing a global Bridges for Humanity, looking for peace instead of war. And I have a couple of comments and a question. The first comment is that Iranians are trying to develop certain sciences and certain technologies that was not available to them for a long, long time, and still is not available for countries of their size. I remember in 1960 when President Kennedy got elected, in his speech said, we're going to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely. Not because it's so easy, because it's hard, and that's how he said that. And the Iranians have picked up that, and they're trying to develop the atomic energy for the peaceful purposes. And then the whole world question there that they're against them, say, well, we're not supposed to do this, just go ahead and build maybe cars and maybe bicycles, so just leave this alone. And the Iranians say, look, we like to be suppliers of energy, so we're trying to supply the world with the fuel for the upcoming energy, which is the atomic energy, to produce. The other comment is that...
A question,
Is there
please.
a
If you
question?
could just, we have very limited time. If you could please
All right.
ask the question.
And
Thank
the
you.
other comment is Imam Khomeini...
How about the question?
Yeah. Imam Khomeini said that America is the great shaitan and the little shaitan is British. So this mindset has proven to be true because we don't have a very good track record in dealing with people in the world, especially if they are weak. Now, I want to know,
Thank you, please.
because Iran wants to supply the world with the fuel, why can't we accept that as a fuel supplier? Like they have oil, now they want to be a supplier for nuclear fuel for reactors to produce
Okay, so
electricity.
Okay, we
wha-
get it, yeah.
thank
That's
you
it.
so much.
Thank you.
I've always seen the Iranian ambitions with regard to a nuclear program as much less ambitious to that, not to being a supplier to the world, but rather meeting their own internal energy needs. And that's the way some other players in the Middle East, like the United Arab Emirates, which has an active nuclear power program, has described things and how they always respond when people say, you've got gobs of oil, why do you need that? Well, the economics are such that it does make sense to try to meet some of your domestic energy needs through nuclear power and have that much more oil to sell. So I didn't think Iran was thinking in terms of being, the next source of nuclear fuel for other countries.
Obviously, Iran has to get out from under UN Security Council resolutions before anybody is going to have any confidence in its nuclear program. There is evidence that Iran did research into building and testing a nuclear weapon. Hasn't done it, but it did research, and it's not cooperated in terms of showing the sites to the IAEA. It hasn't produced the scientists who took part in this research. So it has a lot of questions it has to clear up first.
Hey, Paul. Mark Kimmett. Going back to the question of containment, the practical issues of containment have had some criticisms. First of all, I think you're right on target, and let me stipulate up front, I agree with you. But the questions out there about containment still rebound. Number one, containment requires a declaratory policy. Declaratory policy has to be credible. How do we address the fact that there are probably not too many people in the United States that would stand behind a declaratory policy or would affect a declaratory policy or declaratory action in response if a nuclear weapon went off in the Middle East? Number two, our allies in the Middle East, our credibility is at an all-time low. Our allies in the Middle East probably wouldn't see a declaratory policy as being credible. So three, how do we stop the consequence of that, which would be a declaratory policy not seen as credible, a nuclear armed Iran, which would then have a potential consequence for a nuclear arms race in the Middle East? Could you address those, because I haven't figured it out yet?
Well, I think there's several dimensions there, Mark. I mean, I hadn't really thought this through, but I think you're right that more attention has to be given to, shall we say, a fresh declaratory policy, because we've had them in the past. And perhaps what we might think about now is some, upping the Carter Doctrine, which was a clear, bold declaratory policy, at the time of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which referred to the Persian Gulf region. We probably should dust that off and see how we need to update it or change it, given current circumstances. Containment, as George Kennan would remind us if he were still with us, is not just a military thing, but rather is a set of political and economic as well as security strategies aimed at dealing with troublesome states until and unless they transform. And I think that applies just as much to the Iran situation as it does to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So I agree with you that any extension of, say, a U.S. nuclear umbrella to other Persian Gulf states does immediately raise a credibility problem. That's only one dimension of containment. You look at something like what the Emiratis have done with their own military and especially their own air force. They have an air force now, as you're probably aware, Mark, that would stand up very well against the Iranians if we had an altercation between the two in the air over the Persian Gulf today. It doesn't always have to be a U.S. military umbrella that implies a direct military intervention.
No, I think that's well said. I still don't entirely buy the proliferation argument. I think that Turkey is a member of NATO, so it doesn't need that. I mean, Turkey has Article 5 already. Egypt is going to be embroiled in its own internal politics for a long time. The last thing they're going to be thinking about is a nuclear program, which leaves Saudi Arabia and maybe the Emirates. And even there, I mean, the Saudis presumably could pay the Pakistanis to retaliate on their behalf without having to develop the infrastructure themselves. This assumes, again, that Iran is going to actually use nukes against anybody or actually threaten to use nukes against anybody. And it's still very hard for me to see that. When I look at their nuclear program, I see it as something that they do for national prestige. It's one of the few things that they think can hold the population together. The population in general supports Iran's right to peaceful nuclear energy. And what else do they have to show for 33 years? I mean, they have to show some sort of technological prowess since they haven't been able to give a happy and prosperous life to most of their people. So I don't see it as something that they would actually use. It's something to deter others and to puff themselves up.
And as for a decision, say, by the Saudis as to whether to go the nuclear route, I give the Saudis enough credit to think through in detail exactly those sorts of issues in my earlier remarks that I was accusing ourselves of not thinking through in detail what a nuclear weapon does and does not do for them, just as what it would and would not do for the Iranians in the context of Persian Gulf security.
And is it your view that the Saudis, though, would like to see the Israelis and the Americans in an airstrike against Iran, or is that, do you think, just rhetoric?
This is one of these things that has become an urban myth. I mean, it's a misinterpreted line in one of those leaked cables. Prince Turki, among others, has been clearest and most outspoken about this. He said a new war would be a catastrophe, for us as well as others. And my last time I was in the Gulf talking to Saudis and Emiratis, the consistent message was, yes, we are concerned about Iran. Yes, we are concerned about this nuclear thing. And we wish you Americans would figure out some way to deal with it. But we don't want a war. We don't want a war.
Yeah.
So this business about cutting off the head of the snake means the Saudis would smile at an Israeli attack on Iran is simply nonsense.
Yeah. And if you look at the public opinion polls among Arab populations, not officials, Israel is always the number one threat, followed closely by the United States, and Iran is a distant third. So most Arabs don't see Iran as a threat. I mean, Iran's biggest threat would be if we or Israel were to attack, Iran might retaliate conventionally against the Saudi oil fields or terminals. I mean, that's the scenario that's much more likely, frankly.
Yeah, the scenario that took place when Brookings had a tabletop exercise on this that I participated in a couple of years back, which started with control as the first move, having an Israeli strike on Iran, on the nuclear facilities. And by the time the exercise was over, missiles were flying all over the Middle East. The Iranians were attacking the Saudis under the assumption that they had winked at Israeli use of Saudi airspace in conducting the initial attack.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you both for your very constructive insights, and let's hope we can meet in a year's time to talk about the details of the implementation of the talks, the agreement. Thank you.
All right.